Hello, everybody. It's Tuesday, June 3rd, 2025, beginning of the year. Did a show with my very old dear friend, Chris Schroeder, a man who wears many hats, although he's only wearing one hat in this image, about how America now swims in what he called an ocean of black swans. He was talking about the uncertainty of our globalized age and how America needed to understand that. 5 or almost 6 months later, Chris is back. It's great to see him. He's a world traveler, just back from Estonia, spent some time in India. Chris, what has most surprised you? What is the most self-evident unknown black swan over the last 5 months since we last talked?
I mean, we're living in black swans and mauve swans and everything else. I mean, the Netherlands today just collapsed. The government collapsed. I mean, things are sort of pivoting all the time. But there are two that I just had a close look at. One, as you pointed out, I was in India for 3 weeks, and I met with some of the leaders, both in government and business in the technology world across the country. And what was very interesting to me was nobody really was talking about Pakistan at all. And I would pull on that string and ask people about it. And invariably, folks said, it's just not that big of a deal. They're doing their own thing. Their economy's not that good. No real issues, nothing really to worry about. It's just, they'll do their thing, but we're busy and the world is about to become India's world. And I had one guy said to me, he said, we have 4 concerns right now internationally, and they are China, and then maybe Pakistan. And right after those, and I had the most beautiful, wonderful experience with interesting people, interesting politicians, incredible food, incredible hospitality, tons and tons of tourists. And 5 days later, everything that everyone said to me and everything I experienced just blew up, literally blew up. Kashmir, of course, had the terrible terrorist attack. India and Pakistan were on the border of a war. There was nobody 48 hours earlier who had any of this on the radar at all. And similarly, I was just, as you pointed out, in Estonia. There was a big tech gathering there. I met a lot of politicians in defense tech. I met a lot of the entrepreneurs in defense tech. Half of them are from Ukraine. And I don't think anyone, if they knew it, they sure weren't talking about that there's a whole new war. There's a whole new procurement of war. There's a whole new delivery of war. And Ukraine, which a lot of people felt like was back on their tail and had no choice but to negotiate, gave an unbelievable blow to the Russians just a couple of days ago. And I don't know, that wasn't on anybody's radar of anybody I was talking about. And so, Michael Waltz gets fired, and then President Trump gives a speech in Saudi Arabia, which sounds like the death knell to neoconism. It's an extraordinary speech if you haven't listened to it or read the transcript of it. So the question is not what black swans are happening, it's the quantity of them and what lessons we can draw from them.
Are there any white swans left, Chris?
I don't know. I really don't know. The Mets pitching is no good. Like, that seems pretty, you could take that to
I mean,
even
I was mentioning before, even my English football team won a competition this year for the first time in 17 years. So in Bilbao, so there are certainly lots of black swans around. Let's talk a little bit more about your trip to India. You wrote a wonderful Substack post about it a couple of weeks ago, the new idea of India. When we first started talking about you coming back on the show, before we both went overseas, India and Pakistan was very much in the news. I take your point on Pakistan. It's always a second level issue. But did that incident last month, did it make any difference? I mean, I know you spent some time in Kashmir. Isn't it one of these things that always blows up and then goes away?
We'll tell. I mean, that's certainly the early signs of it, is that the thing got stabilized when, as you saw, and many of our very good friends, people who understand India and Pakistan much better than I do, were sort of saying this thing could spin out of control, and all the scenarios were rough. And obviously, this is the first real conflict among nuclear powers. And then it seemed, to your point, kind of settle down. And I think the real answer is that we will see. We don't know yet. We know that the initial thing got pulled back, and it sounds like the President Trump and Secretary of State actually played not an inconsequential role, and probably 2 actors who wanted to get pulled back somewhat. But no one is forgetting this thing. No one is forgiving this thing. So the real answer to your question is time will tell.
A couple of weeks ago, we also had the very distinguished British historian or Anglo-Indian historian William Dalrymple on the show about how Ancient India Transformed the World. His new book, The Golden Road, is, as always with Dalrymple, a bestseller. I know you've enjoyed it, Chris.
Very much.
You are a tech guy, an investor. You look at tech trends. I'm sure most of the time you spent in India was focused on tech, and obviously lots of headlines about Tim Cook and Trump and India. Is India reshaping the modern world in tech terms? I mean, we'll talk a little bit more about China later, but it's rare to hear of India pushing the envelope. No one would deny that India is influential in technological terms, but when it comes to AI, for example, people always portray it as a race between the United States and China. Is India a leader in any respect when it comes to tech, Chris?
One of the most feedback I got back on that post, again, for people who really know India pretty well, is that the idea that this is India's moment. I am not the first one to point that out for some period of time. And so one of the questions I asked when I met with people, again, from the policy worlds to tech worlds and business worlds, is India going to have a deep seek moment? And the question almost confused people. They just hadn't, it was clear they hadn't thought about it. I mean, they were aware of deep seek. They knew that it was something kind of special. AI is certainly a commitment on everybody's mind. People are thinking about it. Every entrepreneur is using it in every fund. But the idea that there may be a breakout in the very structure of how AI is rendered was not something that I heard about. But on the other hand, I did hear a tremendous amount of ambition in tech. And in fact, thinking that deep seek moment of India may not necessarily be in AI, but it could be in other areas. Space, of course, is a place where they've been playing very significantly. They're thinking very aggressively about upping their game in chips. They're very cognizant that 60+% of the chip reliance they have, even within India itself, is with China, and they want to change that and play at a higher level. They're very aware of the incredible talent they have not only in India, but in America and elsewhere. That is something to be bridged. I must say one of the more interesting conversations I had was about sort of in the middle about using and implementing nuclear and new reactors in a way that'll be hugely meaningful, except on a lot of people's mind, and some regulations that were being relooked at there. And tied to AR was SMRs, small medium reactors, and modular reactors, I'm sorry. And these small modular reactors very well could be a huge solution and a green solution for the energy demands that the big data centers and AI organizations are having. And that was a very real conversation. There's real movement and regulation. But I think to the essence of your question and some of the feedback I got, this is all about delivery. I think it is a moment. That something is a moment doesn't mean necessarily that people capture it. And again, we'll have to see what kind of conversation we're having about that a year from now.
Chris, you know as well as anyone how influential Indians have been in American tech in Silicon Valley. Google, Microsoft are now run by Indian immigrants or people of Indian descent. What was the take? I mean, you were there 3 or 4 weeks ago, so before the big Harvard storm broke. You're also a graduate of Harvard, so I'm sure you have some strong views on what's going on there. But I know that Indians make up, I think, even a larger proportion of foreign students studying in the United States than Chinese people. What was the take, particularly on this isolationism in America, this shift towards a suspicion of foreigners and the closing down of America for foreign students?
I think that the student issue is a little bit, it was humming, but it became more of a thing after I was in India. But I think one of the things that I got very clear was, first of all, almost everyone I met to, without exception, was very, very excited by the connection that Modi and President Trump have connected, that there's going to be opportunity in America. There was a lot of discussion about getting quite close to a free trade agreement, the way the UK had a version of a free trade. We can debate what is a free trade agreement, but certainly on their mind, they were looking at it that way. I had Indians who were very pragmatic say to me that we understand that America has its interests, and America first doesn't necessarily mean America alone. And there's plenty of opportunity for business if you understand this administration's interests, for which they think they've got a decent understanding of it. If you understand your own interests, and they have a very good understanding of that, there's going to be a lot of opportunity to find that intersection. So I think that they felt that they're very open to business around the world and that there's no market bigger than America. They're looking at Europe. They'd love to be in the Gulf. And they're not trying to put a finger in their eye in China per se, but they are very aware that they do not want reliance on China. There was a deep frustration about border issues, particularly in 2020 with China. And the other element they have is that, look, I mean, through the recent history, a lot of countries wake up one day and realize that they're over reliant on China for something. Or in the case of Europe, they were over reliant on Russia for energy. And their general feeling is we know that there are a bunch of things we could become over reliant, and we want to be open to everything. And that sort of mind frame, America's priority one, and they felt very positive about it. And of course, 2 weeks after I came back, Trump started throwing tariffs their way again. And so yet one more theme of this conversation is time will tell. But I must say there was no reticence. There was a tremendous amount of enthusiasm. They like a guy who appears to be very clear in what he wants, and he's not pretending to be one thing and then something else. And even though there's a lot of uncertainty in the thing that he does, they just like that kind of directness. And so we'll have to see. The student issue, as I said, came a little bit later, and there are obviously a lot of different dynamics going on with that. I mean, I must say at the end of the day, the greatest story of the United States of America has been the great talent coming here and making this their home and making themselves American as much as anybody else is American. And, I think that's one issue that needs to be explored. And the issues of the conflicts of what's going on in these universities and their ideology and what number is the right number of international students. I mean, these are all reasonable debates, not really being debated, I think, with a whole bunch of reason right now, but in a real tough series of circumstances. So yet again, time will tell.
Chris, I'm sure wherever you are, whether it's Estonia or India or London, people are asking you the same question. You're a tech guy, you're a politics guy, you've been in and out of government. They're all asking you what's happening in America. And I'm sure the expression on their face is a degree of bemusement and shock and curiosity. What do you tell them?
Look, I think it's depending where you go, where the patina of that question. That question is different in Western Europe and even different in Eastern Europe. It's different in different countries in Europe. It obviously shares a sense that we've had a reliant 75-year history of engagement and shared values. And this is somewhere not only between shock and awe, but also, offensive and concerning. Yet at the same time, obviously, a lot of these into challenges that they knew they had and they knew they had to address. And in a way, this was a forcing function. So I think there's still a lot being worked out. And as I alluded to before, and I certainly saw this in the Gulf as I did in India, there are a lot of people who are actually happier dealing with this administration than some of the previous administrations because they just feel like there's clarity in the transaction and they know who's got what interests and how they're thinking about it overarchingly. But look, I think the thing that I do say to everybody who has some at least unease about all the unpredictedness and uncertainty, if not outright, unhappiness because of some of the elements that have pulled through in very controversial and I think unnecessarily controversial ways very often, is that we focus a lot on values in our conversations globally. And I think that's important. We talk about democracy, and you can't find a man who more loves democracy, has benefited more from it, thinks it's a greater thing that has happened than anything in the history of the world. And at the same time, I think we sometimes don't conflate enough our hard-nosed governance issue. We can get all worked up about politics and about style and about different things people do. But what we're missing is that if more and more people believe that our governance, in whatever form, and this has really been an issue, I think, in the West, is at best incompetent, not delivering the goods, and at worst, an insider's rigged game, you're going to have people who are going to rise wanting a significant and massive alternative. And I think we're living in a world right now that is hyperly anti-incumbent, but they're also heavily anti-incumbent because at the end of the day, they feel like business as usual has not been serving them, that the institutions that we have valued are institutions that serve themselves and not necessarily the reasons why they were exist to begin with. And I think that, by the way, is a very reasonable debate. I think that's a conversation that if it is not well addressed, if we miss it, we have the kind of circumstances around the world that we're seeing here on a regular basis. There was a wonderful, I'll send it to you, but there was a wonderful blog post from a guy that was very, very provocative, where he really sort of called it the liberal Brahmins, I think was the title of the article. And effectively, he was saying that if people don't listen to large swaths of their populace who are not beneficiaries of the things that the elites are benefiting of, and if they think at the end of the day, all they can do is kind of sit back and things will move back towards them, they're not answering my governance question. They're not asking how can they make their party, their view, governance, and democracy deliver. And I think that everyone who wants to think about the world that we're in has to stare at this very, very hard, very analytically, and start saying that, we've got to deliver. There are real, legitimate concerns that people feel, and to ignore them or to brush by them or dismiss them as, not part of your posse, we're seeing the ramifications of that quite clearly.
You spent a lot of time in the Gulf. I know you spent some time in Saudi, obviously Dubai, the Emirates. You also, I know you've been reading Rahul Bhatia's new book on India, The New India, The Unmaking of the World's Largest Democracy, which is about Modi. You mentioned Modi earlier. Are some of these authoritarian leaders, whether they're in India, the Gulf, perhaps even the United States, are they, Chris, better at listening than the old liberal Brahmins?
I think it's very situationally, because part of it is listening, but part of it is instinct. Part of it is to know how to spin up a populist appeal, which again, when you're dealing with a lot of folks who feel that governance is not working for them, is just completely fertilizer ground for populism to rise in whatever form, left and right, by the way. And so I think that the lesson is that when people, there's a wonderful quote from Reinhold Niebuhr, the great theologian, who said in a definition that it's only when people are uncertain that they're doubly certain. It's only when they're uncertain that they're doubly certain. And these are, to the beginning of our conversation, there are black swans all over. And over the last decade, so you could be my age or you could be 20 years old, and the rules of the world are dramatically different and changing rapidly. There's a lot of unsuredness, and in unsuredness, there is people seeking sure answers. So I don't know yet if it's about listening, though I think that's certainly a big part of it, but it is certainly weighing into an understanding of this dissatisfaction and giving certain answers, blunt answers to things in very confusing times.
Chris, you're also I think you're the chairman of the German Marshall Fund of the US, so you know transatlantic relations as well as anyone. You're just back from Estonia. I know you've got some interest in American military tech. Big companies like Anduril, of course, are doing well. Facebook, sorry, not Facebook. Facebook is, Meta is now working increasingly, like so many of the other Silicon Valley giants, with military tech. Are companies like Anduril and Palantir, are they changing the relationship between the United States and Europe when it comes to military stuff?
They certainly are playing into the central needs of a very, very new era of war and conflict, right? I mean, I think a lot of institutions and a lot of the major manufacturers of defense companies over the years still almost think that they're, back in the 90s or the 2000s, not necessarily in technology, but, you do things a certain way. Your procurement process takes years and years, and your products take things years and years. And we're learning that that's just not satisfactory. So you have people like Anduril and Palantir, and there are now companies out of Germany, which are very interesting, that are doing interesting technology. And what ends up happening is they get gummed up by 20th century processes. So, I mean, let me put this in perspective. And obviously, I'm not an expert in procurement, but I have been digging into this a lot. And even without digging into it, I hear this from entrepreneurs, I hear this from investors, and I hear this from defense ministers around the world, which is you can have all the money that you want committed to defense. And it is exciting or interesting that Germany has stepped up with very large numbers, and large numbers matter politically at home. They matter to warn our adversaries so that you're taking things seriously. But it takes the United States on average, and on average isn't quite a fair statement, so think of this as an index, but it takes the United States somewhere between 3 and 5 years to get new technology and defense tech through licensing and testing, 3 to 5 years. Right? Europe is on average 5 to 7 years. Everyone talks about bringing that down, but China is on average under 18 months. And the biggest takeaway I had being in Estonia, where I met with a bunch of Ukrainian tech startups, most of whom are doing things like drone capability and everything else, is that the way procurement happens in the real time in the new war is people learn something on the battlefield and it's changed dramatically. So they start using AI and other technology to analyze it, unpack it, decide what kind of either printer the front up. They send it back to their capitals, and literally within weeks, they're launching a new upgraded series of drones or information war capabilities or other capabilities going forward. That is war now. And so when we start talking about things like regulatory environments and procurement process, which are years, and even our late major player in the field, China, is doing it in a fraction of the time at very heavy and sophisticated technology. And we know that the nature of war is evolving and changing in ways that, again, no one I think would have predicted what happened this week in Ukraine. And you say to yourself, we got a problem. I mean, this is a serious problem. And politicians aren't good at breaking up regulations. Regulators like their job; they like to play into their tactical areas. The big manufacturers get benefit from business as usual, and we're in business as usual in a world where nothing is as usual. And I must say that in thinking about this and Estonia, it just is very, very clear to me that this is something that everyone talks about, that it'll move faster, and I'm not sure we're seeing any evidence of it to the degree that is required yet.
I'm guessing, Chris, you probably know better than this on me, that there are lots of Estonian advisors to the Ukrainian government or the Ukrainian military authorities. Of course, their successful drone attack on Russia this week is hitting the headlines. When it comes to Estonia, when we talk again at the end of the year, what would be a black swan moment in the Baltics? Would it be the Russians doing nothing or the Russians doing something?
Well, certainly everyone there is prepared or thinking about being prepared for them at some point doing something. An assumption, if not now, at some point. And though there is sort of an idea that I will also hear from senior individuals that, under the blanket of NATO, they wouldn't dare. So again, throughout the history, you know this so well from all that you've studied and read and talked about on your show. I mean, throughout the history of war, there are people who say it can never happen, and there are people sort of in the wilderness shouting it's going to happen. And obviously, we remember the latter moments because they're the ones that are so significant. So I think that there certainly is that debate going on. But I think being on the border, this is a country, Estonia is a country that's already spending 5% of their GDP in defense. They do tremendous co-authorship with Ukrainians and other innovators in Poland and what else. They're very aware of it. We think of, Estonia is not a large country in population, but obviously punches well above its weight in technology, but also the border is the size of Netherlands on Russian. I mean, it's actually a big geographic construct. So it is something that needs to be taken seriously. Black swans should be thought very carefully about. But I also think that they in particular are like a lab almost. I mean, if I could sort of get my sisters and brothers in Washington meet with the senior of Estonia to get sort of a bit of an arm's length happening in Ukraine. I mean, obviously, understanding and studying Ukrainians and what they're doing is invaluable and perhaps not being done enough. But I love, I must say, the Estonians talking about happening because they can be both circumspect, historic, and have a little bit of a lens of not only empathy, but sort of reflection that makes their takeaways and lessons very powerful. I feel the same way about Taiwan on information war. I mean, they're like a petri dish of the latest technology being put to them in information war. And talking to them about China, you just get a different lens, the way you get a different lens talking about China with Australia or Singapore, which I also love. But remember, Andrew, the Baltics really isn't a thing. I mean, it's a construct we've talked about for decades. But the fact of the matter is, in many respects, I think the Estonians have more in common with the Finns, and there's a geographic connectivity and history of some sort. But they're also a very different, very unique. We would listen to them very, very carefully. They understand the playbook of what's happening around them with as much circumspection as pretty much anyone I've talked to.
Speaking of that part of the world, last week we had our mutual friend Edward Luce on the show, the FT's man in DC. His new book is a biography of Zbigniew Brzezinski. You've worked very closely in DC. You work with James Baker, for example. Should we, Chris, be nostalgic for those big players, the Zbigs, the Bakers, the Kissingers? Are we living in an age where we need more authority when it comes to foreign policy? The Trump administration, of course, has been heavily criticized both domestically and internationally for its absence of authority on international politics.
Look, I sort of I think of Secretary Baker as quite different than Henry Kissinger and Brzezinski. And I think there are a lot of people I respect tremendously and much smarter than I am on the history of diplomacy and global history that have admiration for the grand strategy. And obviously, both men, Brzezinski and Kissinger, were extremely complex people. You go to I do a lot of my work in Southeast Asia and rising markets, emerging markets, and their view of Kissinger, if they remember him at all, is a little bit different than the sort of great sage, wise man that some of the crowd in Washington admire. And like, any significant figure, there's truth across the spectrum. And if nothing else, both men had unbelievable minds. They had unbelievable theories of where the world was going. They were shaped very specifically by the circumstances that brought them here. And, when they spoke, you had to listen to them and whatever. But I must say, I've always remained skeptical of people, particularly academics and somewhat ivory tower people who have these big thoughts about how the world moves and chess moves or whatever else, because I spend most of my time bottom up. I spend most of my time with young people, all around the world who are thinking very differently. They're constantly changing the game very differently. And the idea that we live in a semi-Metternich world where the big actors can move chess pieces and they have these grand strategies. If you assess both men's actual track record, you would come to the conclusion that their batting average, historically speaking, was significantly mixed. And that doesn't mean that you can't admire their skill or their frameworks or learning from them or be, sort of in awe of them, either positively or negatively. But I very suspect by the arrogance and the hubris and the elitism that comes in the idea of grand strategy. And Baker, to me, was always in a different case. I don't think he thought he was a great strategist and he was a great sort of navigator of huge of shifts historically, where he kept his head and was very pragmatic and very constructive about it. That's my model. Like, yes. So at that level, I wish we would have leaders in government who have actually experienced things in the private sector. They've actually had to build things. They do understand how government works. They're very pragmatic. They're very clear on each other's interests, and they know time, and that this is not an academic exercise at all. Of course, this administration and the last administration, it's true of the Biden administration. The fact is the White House wanted to control all decisions in global engagement, and they had people as their secretaries of state that, work in that construct. So we've seen it work in different ways. Franklin Roosevelt didn't rely too much on his Secretary of State, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I must say, through whatever vehicle or whatever individuals, a sort of hard-nosed look at the world as it is, and balancing a pragmatism in this and being respectful that every country has its own views, which may be very different than our views, and experiences different than our views, is what's really needed in the 21st century.
Some people might be listening and saying that's a little relativistic, certainly when it comes to Russia. If Brzezinski was around now, he might suggest that the Russians, whether it's the Soviets or the Russians, whether it's Putin or Stalin, they behave in the same way. What's your take on Russia? You're just back from Estonia, Chris. Have they changed their ways? Should we have to understand international business? There isn't much international business left in Russia. No,
I don't. Well, there is actually much more than we think. I mean, the shocking thing is that the amount of even energy that got out of Russia, even to Europe, is staggering in the process of all of this. And of course, so much of Russian trade and business international isn't with the West, it's with the East. And I don't think that Russia would be in this war if it weren't for China and alternatives that have helped keep their economy moving. But that I'm making sort of a different point. It's not about business, I think the intersection of business and policy and technology has never been greater in world history. But I'm not saying like business has the answers to this stuff. I'm saying that you need people who are tough and understand the interests of the others and understand your interests and come at it that way, and not from a sort of academic construct of big chess moves being played. And in terms of what's happening in Russia, I mean, I'm no Russian expert. And in fact, I think I was one of the people 20 years ago who would have told you, in the same way I felt this way about other parts of the world, is that they're going to come around. They have a new generation of entrepreneurs. They have great technology. There's incredible talent there. It will force Russia to change. And I was wrong, and I missed that. And I think to try to understand or pretend that we understand Putin on our terms, as opposed to being very hard-nosed about his terms and the way he thinks about things, is a foundational mistake, particularly now.
You're a big reader, Chris. You always read 100 books a year, and you always come out with an excellent post at the end of the year. I know you've enjoyed Edward Wong's At the Edge of Empire, Families Reckoning with China. Over the last 6 months, I'm not anything but a China expert, but I've always assumed that the Chinese do play chess when it comes to international politics, and Trump seems to be playing another game, if that's the right way to describe it. In your take, in your global travels and your many conversations, are the Chinese ultimately the beneficiary of all this chaos, all this black swan moment in world history?
I'm not an expert in China either, but I can report on the things that I hear and observe, because clearly there is a strategy there. I think in a way that we haven't had a really clear China strategy entirely in the last 10 years, other than kind of a new version of containment. But I think that when some people in this administration point out that historians will look back at a period when all we did was outsource manufacturing and a lot of core elements of what made America great at that point to low-cost labor, and thought that at the end of the day, China would come into the world order just by being welcomed into the world order, clearly has a significant amount of learning and assessment that we have to do in thinking about China today. And at one level, it's still a very hyperly centralized planned country, and it's got plenty of problems. It's not 10 feet tall in terms of its demographics and its economic issues and everything else. But you've got a tremendous number of hyperly talented, hardworking people who are incredibly innovative. I think the DeepSeek moment was a very significant moment. I think other things we're seeing happening in space and defense tech and so on shows tremendous sophistication, both not only from strategy, but execution of strategy. And so it is conceivable that the weights on them will hold them back. But I must say that I probably would not be living my life either in business or in policy as taking that as my bet that the house is rotted underneath and it's about to collapse. I think there's just too much energy and potential there for all the challenges that it has. And I will say that around the world, when I talk to people, there's tremendous admiration for China, admiration for their products, admiration for their customer service, admiration for their prices, and very, very happy to do business with them. But I do think, not unlike in India, more and more people are saying, I don't want to be over-reliant on anybody. And they want options. Many countries now feel that they're open, and they don't want to be in a position where they have to rely on anyone, and certainly not someone like China as a way that their future economy has to do. So I think we're living in a period where lots and lots of countries are saying, what is it that we want to be going forward? Which is, of course, the first great question as we think about strategy. The question will be, will we get locked into the bias and the stories we've told ourselves of the last 20 years, or will we, one, come to a strategy in a very new world and, most importantly, execute on it? But that doesn't mean necessarily that China wins and America loses, or vice versa, because I go around the world and I'm seeing rising economies everywhere, and they're looking very forward to their seats in the table. 300 million people in Nigeria have just joined the middle class in the last decade. Indonesia is doing some really quite interesting things. People like to say that Latin America is challenged. It's got its challenges, but there's no question that in Brazil and Mexico and elsewhere, people are thinking very, very, very significantly about what kind of place they want to be in the future. Politics too often wins. We'll sometimes get distracted from the major issues into a lot of the stuff that social media takes us through. But it is a very different period. And I think the big takeaway is to take China lightly in any way would be a mistake. And I think most people more than appreciate that and are just figuring out what it means while at the same time having engagement with it.
Chris, when you're not traveling around the world, when you're not in Estonia or India or the Middle East, you're in Washington, D.C. We did a show last week with Michael Kimmage, who took over the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center in D.C. I'm sure you know Kimmage, and you certainly know the Wilson Center. He wrote a piece for Liberties, We Must Save the Books, about the closing of the center, the crisis of the Kennan Institute. And he described this as seeing what he called a ruin in Washington, D.C. You're a D.C. guy. Are there ruins? Has Doge undermined some of the fundamental civilizational qualities, the imperial qualities of Washington, D.C. and institutes like the Wilson Center and the Kennan Institute? Are you as concerned as Kimmage?
We had a very dear friend who was senior Democrat working the sort of the global affairs and defense related areas of the last administration, who said to me when USAID got shut down, he said, look, we all knew half of what USAID was either unaccountable or really wasn't moving any dial forward anywhere. No one wanted to prioritize taking it on. And that's a very honest statement, because I think that's true of a lot of elements of governance in Washington, and business as usual is never going to change that. I spoke recently to a gentleman who was the deputy secretary of a major cabinet back in the times of Clinton. And you remember Al Gore had this, we're going to reinvent government. And he got they got a notice from the White House saying they had to reduce 10% of their workforce, started sharpening down the bureaucratic momentum that got built. And he said to me, he said, we all know, every one of us who runs a cabinet or is close to running a cabinet knows that there's 10% easily defined and probably more, and no one ever does it and everything kind of moves on. And so we got the order and figured we'd have to figure this thing out. And I said, so what percentage did you reduce? And we went like this. He said, I don't know, 0.5%. And I said, why? How's that possible? You got a letter from the White House. And he said, well, our inbox was filled with other things. Nobody ever followed up. And so the game is the game, and the machine kept moving, and people have other priorities. And you will then wake up all of a sudden, you have government that at best doesn't seem to be performing and could be incompetent. And at worst seems like an insider rigged game, spending lots of money that people cannot understand how it affects them by the spending of it. And a problem arises where business as usual was never, ever going to take that on. Now, we can get into a debate in a different way with respect. You don't need to tweet that they're criminals just because they were in part of a system that you want to change. Like, all that kind of stuff is, unarguable. And the inconsistencies that will come in it, and which battles are chosen when, history will have to show whether they were bad or good. But I don't think that there's any question that it takes very unusual thinking and tenacity to take on governance and try to do something which is different. So I'll give you one concrete example that has stuck with me. There's a guy that I know has been doing Doge, a very serious guy from Silicon Valley who's been doing a lot of the Doge work for the Veterans Affairs. So, yes, there needs to be cuts, and yes, there'll be that kind of thing. Yes, there's going to be debate about should you cut or not cut. But he said, no one's talking about the thing that's most interesting to me. This is him speaking. He said, we realize now with the data that we're starting to look at, there's going to be no organization in the history of the world that will predict veterans suicide in the Veterans Administration. We are bringing a level that gives incredible insight to individuals who need help that we can get ahead of. And so, Andrew, to your question, to know that we have 20th century institutions that need to be rethought of and perhaps treated bluntly with some bad ramifications, knowing that there were bad ramifications that were happening in any event, and at the same time say, are there opportunities of things we can unleash with this, is, I think, a fascinating conversation. The problem is the way that it's being done and all the different dynamics that happen in Washington. And I think a tremendous amount of forces of not only wanting to go back, but people who are very understandably outraged by some of the sort of the constitutional approaches to it, means that we can't have that serious conversation. We cannot have a conversation where people can step back and say, something, business as usual is never going to fix something that needed to be fixed, and it can unleash things that we never thought governments could do. We could be Singapore on steroids with science and technology now if we could bring it to bear. But we can't have that kind of a conversation. But to me, it is in the midst of it.
Finally, Chris, I know you want to save the books like the rest of us. You're a huge reader. I mentioned you read 100 books, or you try to read 100 books a year. You write about it at the end of the year. I know you've been reading some biographies of filmmakers. You're reading a biography of the great Japanese filmmaker Akira Kurosawa, and then one of Satyajit Ray, the iconic Indian filmmaker. Why an interest in film? I never thought of you as a movie guy, but what in these strange times, what value does cinema, especially the classic movies of Kurosawa or Ray, what do they bring us? What wisdom?
Well, I mean, I do adore film, and films had an enormous impact on my life, and there's much analogy I have. I believe it reflects culture and history at its time as much as whatever it may be doing more broadly in the message giving. A good film like from Bong can make me rethink. Parasite made me stop and breathe and reassess a lot of my engagements, the way I think about the world. So I've just huge admiration for it. I've huge admiration for the craft, how they do it, how they put things together. I'm an enormous fan of David Lean, and he was a tyrant, but incredibly brilliant guy who made sure that every detail was attended to in order to make these canvases of spectacular story and moving storytelling that both reflected the time, but also reflected what he was trying to capture in literature into film. So I have had all that for a very long time. I must say, in some respects, when I go on my travels, I love to read about, or I go through a series of YouTube interviews of the great directors of the countries there, because in a way, they are journalists of a kind. They are thinking about what's happening in society, and they want to reflect it in different ways. And sometimes it's artistic and expressive, and sometimes it's almost documentary like. And memoirs by Ray, first of all, just his influences and the neorealism of Italy, which was a kind of a reporting and documentary look of Italy after World War II, highly influenced him wanting to tell a very specific story about India and India's rise at the time he was in. I just have found riveting. And the Kurosawa, his memoir goes right up to Rashomon, and so it's really the influences and forces and history that was affecting the film industry and how the film industry was affecting history that I just have found riveting. And so these are great storytellers. They obviously have great impact on us as entertainment and art. But at the same time, they really have helped me think about how things are shifting in the worlds they've been in, and that are messages and things I can prepare for as I look at the world.
Well, Chris Schroeder, the global traveler, a man who spends more time perhaps on the road than almost anyone, 250,000 miles a year, brings us great wisdom, books, movies, global politics, tech. Keep well, Chris, and we'll talk at the end of the year and get your 100 books of 2025. So we'll talk again, certainly.